to start off this panel, we have this is a session is CLE accredited. Anyone looking forward to that? Oh, we have a few. The State Bar of Texas, so to receive credit, sign at the clipboard located at the back of the room. I'm not sure who has that, but someone will have a clipboard at the back of the room after this is over. So today we get to talk about a very simple issue. We all know how the dollars flow. It's just really simple. I really don't even know why we have a panel on it. But no, all jokes aside, school finance. Probably one of the most complex things in all of fiscal policy world across the whole globe. Whenever you look at how dollars flow and what's happening. I mean, the TEA reported the latest data for school year 14-15. We spend about $61 billion overall. There's 4.8 million students across the state. So it's about $12,761 per student. And those come from a number of different areas, local property taxes, then you have recaptured dollars, and we're going to get into all that discussion today. When you look at the Supreme Court's decision recently on school finance, they found it to be constitutional. And some were surprised by that. But it wasn't that they just left it there, though, and said, well, everything's just perfect. They said that it looks like what the system really has are Band-Aid upon Band-Aid upon Band-Aid, and that there needs to be some sort of structural reforms moving forward. And I think we're going to hear some differing opinions on how that might look moving forward. And we have a great panel of some experts here today to talk about that. And it's all important to all of us. I mean, I had the pleasure of going to private school from kindergarten to second grade, and public school from third grade to sixth grade, and then homeschool from seventh grade through 12th grade. So homeschoolers can kind of do something from time to time. And you know, I was proud of that. But there were some budgeting issues within my family to get me to go to homeschool and private school. We were from a low-income household, and so when those property tax dollars were flowing to the state, it were dollars that couldn't flow to my homeschooling and my education. However, others were benefiting throughout the process. And so I think that there's some things that we need to look at to where we get away from or think about whether or not it's good that we have equitability by school district versus what's equitable by the student, and where dollars maybe can follow the child, or should they follow the school district. And those are all things we're going to talk about today. So I hope you're ready for a simple subject. And we have a great group of panelists. So let me go ahead and introduce each one of them. To my left here is Michael Barba, Associate Director of the Public Policy at the Texas Catholic Conference. He provides public policy guidance to the Texas dioceses, schools, and parishes in order to connect Catholic school teaching with political action. Prior to serving at the Texas Catholic Conference, Barba was a policy analyst at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, where he focused upon public education, school finance, and educational choice, along with a good friend of mine. Also served as an analyst for Citizens Tools, a small Austin startup which published nonpartisan explanations of public policies. Completed his undergraduate education at the University of Dallas, where he majored in philosophy and politics. He is currently writing his master's thesis, Answering Doubts of the Young, Book X of Plato's Laws for the University of Dallas. That sounds like a page turner, Michael. I guess I should mention first that I'm Dr. Vance Ginn. I'm the economist here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I think I forgot to mention that. I was so interested in getting to them first. So thank you for being here, Michael. To his left is Representative James Frank. He has served as president of the board of Straight Street and of home educators around Texoma, the vice chairman of Wichita Falls Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and served on the advisory board of the Lilani. Is that how you pronounce it? Lilani? Okay. That's an old one? All right. Lonnie Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise at Midwestern State University. Serves as the vice chair of the Defense and Veterans Affairs Committee and on the Natural Resources Committee, which those could be shuffled some, but that was from last session. Spent 11 years in banking in Fort Worth and Wichita Falls, spending his last 5 years as commercial lending manager of the Wichita Falls area for Norwest Wells Fargo Bank. In 2000, Frank ventured into business by purchasing a local metal fabrication business. Metal. What did I say?
Fabrication is what I do now.
Oh, okay.
Make up stuff as we go.
My fault. Metal fabrication. All right. Business BW Fabricators. All right. Since that time, the company, now known as Sharp Iron Group. Did I get that one right? All right, good. Has grown from 15 employees in 2000 to 110 employees today, and earned a degree in finance from Texas A&M University. Thank you, Representative Frank, for being here. To his left is Dr. Wayne Pierce. He has served as the executive director of the Equity Center since January 2001. Previously, he was the superintendent of Rosebud Lot and Kaufman ISD for 15 years. He has also served as the ad hoc instructor of public school finance courses to graduate students at Baylor University and Texas A&M at Commerce. He is a president and co-founder of Texas Association of Rural Schools and president of Texas Association of Mid-Sized Schools. He received his doctorate degree in education from Baylor University and attended Southwest Texas State University, where he obtained his undergraduate degree in education and a master's in mathematics. All over the board there, sir. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And to his left, we have Dr. Ben Scafidi. Is that correct? All right. Professor of Economics and Director of the Education Economics Center at Kennesaw State University. He is also a Friedman Fellow with EdChoice and a Senior Fellow with the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. Previously, he served as the Director of Education Policy for the Georgia Gold Scholarship Program. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Virginia and his bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Notre Dame. So another doctor in economics. So I feel sorry for you. It's a long process. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to our distinguished panelists, starting with Michael Barba. Please give a round of applause for him.
Thank you, Vance. So, grab the clicker. By the name of the panel, I take our first goal to be to increase transparency. So I'll walk through 4 graphs which are aimed to do just that. First, there's the jar analogy. When we started working on this project, Kent Grusendorf introduced this analogy to both Vance and I in order to hammer home a very important fact. So in this analogy, each jar is a school district, and the total amount to which each district is entitled in any given school year is represented by a full jar. Now, districts collect property taxes in order to fill their jar. Some districts collect too much, like District C there. So the excess goes back to the state. That's recapture, or the Robin Hood system. Now, the jar size for every district depends on enrollment. The jar shape would depend on individual characteristics of a district. So if it's a mid-sized district or a small district, the jar shape would change a little bit, okay? If they have certain student populations, the jar shape would change a little bit. Now, some districts that don't raise enough through local property taxes like A and B, the state has to take the recaptured money and its own money, which primarily comes from sales taxes, and give it to those other 2 districts, A and B, okay? So here's the takeaway from the analogy that Kent was explaining to us. An increase in jar size, so if enrollment grows, means that the district has less revenue, less water in the analogy, to fill their jar. So the state has to add more to that individual district. In the same way, if there's a decrease in jar size, the state benefits, because either in the case of C, it gets more money back, or in the case of A and B, if the jar shrinks, the water fills up the jar, so the state doesn't have to add as much. So the state benefits in that situation. So how does this actually work in practice? In 2014, there were about 225 recaptured districts. Those were in the varied shades of green there. The rest, the white districts, are those into which the state has to pour the revenue, okay? Those are the districts to which the state contributes. The next graph that we'll run through is the foundation school program. So when you hear people refer to the FSP, this is the FSP, what I'm about to walk through. Now, the largest source of money for public education is local property taxes. But state money, the largest source of state money, is general revenue, or GR. Dedicated taxes in the permanent school fund also contribute to public education. Now, all 3 of these sources go to public schools through these 2 accounts, right? The foundation school fund and the available school fund. The available school fund is a much smaller account. The foundation school fund, when you hear FSF, think primary checking account. Okay? This is the largest account through which funds flow from the state to schools. Now, they flow to both school districts and to charter schools from those two accounts. But the more important one, or the larger one, is the FSF. And as we've already seen, there is recapture. So school districts that raise too much revenue, the money goes back into the FSF, which is managed by the Texas Education Agency. Okay? So this is the foundation school program. This is how the funds flow within the system. We'll move to the next graphic, which is intended to help explain what pennies of tax effort means, which is a term that's used a lot by the TEA and is something that is important to understanding the tiers of revenue, which we'll get to later on. Okay? In order to understand pennies of tax effort, what we first have to do is go to a district's total taxable property value. So for this example, we'll use Prosper ISD. They have $3 billion worth of taxable property value, all right, within their district. What you do then is, step two, you break up that $300 billion into $100 blocks, okay? There's 30 million $100 blocks in their $3 billion worth of property value, and then the district levies a certain amount of taxes on each block. They collect a certain amount on each $100 block, all right? Prosper ISD collects $1.67. Or you could also say that they collect 167 pennies of tax effort on that $100 block. You could also say, what we use for other taxes, we could also say that they have a 1.67% tax rate. All right, that's a way that we describe taxes in other places, right? So pennies of tax effort refers to the amount of pennies the district collects on every $100 block of property, right? Are there any questions about that? I see some furrowed brows out there. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them before I move on. Okay, all right, we'll move to Q&A, all right, later on. Okay, so this pennies of tax effort concept is important for understanding the tiers of revenue. Now, what the heck are the tiers of revenue? We can walk through it, and I'll show you tier by tier, okay? So every school district will fall somewhere on this graph. The y-axis is the tax rate that the school district levies, right? And it can be anywhere from 0 to that $1.17 and that 30 cents above that. That's their tax rate. Those are the pennies of tax effort that a district collects, okay? The x-axis, is the district's property value per student, okay? So simply, if a district is wealthier, it's going to fall further to the right. If it's poorer, it's going to fall further to the left. If it has higher tax rate, it'll fall higher on the graph. If it has lower tax rate, it'll fall lower, okay? Now, tier 1 is the largest source of revenue for individual school districts. And it contains everything below that dollar. So that everything within that first percent of tax rate that a district levies is in tier 1. Now, this is where the jar analogy is very helpful, because jar C, as we saw, sends the money back to the state. What exactly does that mean when we look at individual districts? Well, it means that districts that have property wealth in this orange area here are the ones that send the money back to the state. Districts that have less than that orange area are ones that keep their money, and the state adds to the money that they collect, all right? Tier 2 works in a similar way, except that there's two parts of tier 2. Okay? The first part of tier 2 refers to that $1 to $6 tax rate. Those pennies of tax effort, those 5 pennies of tax effort, are the first part of tier 2, and there's no recapture on those tiers. Okay? So if a district is able to collect much more, then the state will guarantee they can keep all of the revenue. All right? So a wealthier district can keep all the revenue there. For the second part of tier 2, there is recapture. Okay? So that's the way tier 2 works. The last tier, tier 3, is it works in a similar way. The states, if the poorer you are, the more money the state gives. That's the light green. The richer you are, the less the state gives, and the more this local district has to give. Okay? Why do we have 3 tiers? Why is it so needlessly complicated? Well, because tier 3 goes to support facilities. This is where districts get money for facilities, where they raise money through bonds and they're able to renovate their facilities or build new school buildings. When you hear interest in sinking or INS, that's what this refers to, is Tier 3. That's INS. Tier 1 and 2 here, when you hear maintenance and operation thrown around by the TA or by committee hearings, that's what that refers to, Tier 1 and Tier 2. That's maintenance and operation tax effort. So if you look at the charter schools, for example, the charter schools get this maintenance and operation, but not the Tier 3, right? They don't get the facilities funding. Okay. Now, all of this is complicated, but what makes the system even more complicated and needlessly complicated is a few things that I don't really have time to go through, and I'm not sure that I could explain even if I tried. One is set-aside funding. So in addition to this system where the state figures out how much we owe you and how much you owe us, the state has set-aside grants that go to specific school districts, some school districts but not others, some schools but not others, all right? They also have hold harmless provisions, which means that even though your district falls somewhere on this graph, we're going to treat it as if it falls somewhere else. Okay, so those are exceptions to the rule. And one of the biggest hold harmless provisions is ASETAR, Additional State Aid for Tax Reduction, which Dr. Wayne Pierce is very good at explaining, and which is a massive hold harmless provision that basically says for 225 of the districts that belong somewhere here, we're going to put them somewhere else. All right, so all of that creates tremendous inequity, tremendous inefficiency in the system because we have a system for school finance and then we provide so many exceptions that even understanding the basics is not enough, okay? Now, I'm convinced if you phase those out, it would increase the transparency and the fairness of the system. And the first condition, I'll move on from there. So, but one example of something else that complicates school finance is the confusion surrounding basic facts about it. Basic facts about any policy area must be understood in their clarity and not denied or manipulated. When that happens, we stop understanding even the basics about a specific policy. The research that we did on school finance began with a very simple question: how much do we spend per student in the state of Texas? You would think that's a simple question to answer, but it's not. So if you go to the LBB, which, I mean, they do the budget for the state. If you go to the LBB, you find that there's about $50 billion in revenue, right? And their recent fiscal size up, there's about $50 billion in revenue. So we went to them and we asked, okay, does this include everything? And they said, yes, it includes everything. We took our finding, our number to Ken Grusendorf and to Talmadge, and they said, well, you know what? 10 years ago when we were in the legislature, it was at about that $50 billion. So, you know, something doesn't seem right. So we went to the TA and asked them, okay, is this $50 billion accurate? And they said, well, if you're looking at revenue collected in that school year, yes. But if you look at the amount of money spent, it's about $61 billion. So that's an $11 billion difference there. That will dramatically change your understanding of spending per student. Okay, so if you take that total, that $61 billion, you divide it by the number of students, all right, which sounds obvious again, but you can count students in different ways. You can count them by attendance, which is the number of kids that actually show up. You can count them by enrollments, which is the number of kids signed into this or signed up to go to school. Or you can count them by weighted attendance. What is weighted attendance? Well, there's different student programs. There's 19 different student programs that have 19 different weights. One is compensatory education, for example, which has a weight of 1.2. So for every 10 low-income students, comp ed students that show up, the state sees 12 and funds 12, right? So the weighted number is going to be larger. If you have a larger denominator, you're going to get a smaller number per student, right? Now, this is something that people cite, for example, on the House floor, the Senate floor, and there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction. No, that's not the right number. But hopefully, this sheds light on why you would end up with different numbers. And there's a legitimate difference to be had about which student count you use. What you should not do, for example, is use, or what you would be, if you're confused, you would do this. You would use the $50 billion number, which would get you much lower spending per student. Or what you see frequently, I have 2 minutes, awesome, I thought it was over time. What you would see frequently, and what you see frequently in the news headlines, is a report about the NEA, the National Educators Association, and they put out a report every couple of years about spending per student. Well, what they're actually looking at is maintenance and operation, right? So if we back up, that's only those two tiers right there. All right, it doesn't include facilities, it doesn't include those set-aside grants that I discussed. And so because of that, if you used just the maintenance and operation, you would end up with even lower spending per student, okay? So when somebody brings up these numbers about we spend this much versus that much, we can at least have a conversation and understand, okay, where are they coming from? And try to provide some clarity on this topic to each other. So because it takes a lot of effort to understand school finance, and it's important to provide transparency. So this brings me to my conclusion, which is that parents don't care about any of this, right? They don't care. All the work that we did on school finance describes basically how a watch is made, and parents just want to make sure that the watch is accurate and that it tells time, right? So we get so attached to specific components, to tier 1 versus tier 2, to acetar or not acetar, that we need to step back and keep in the forefront of our mind that we don't need to preserve specific parts of the system. We need to make sure that the system is student-centered. Student-centered, right? That means that it would be stripped of the hold harmless provisions that I mentioned and that Dr. Pierce talks about frequently. It would also, one of the other things that a student-centered system would do is provide autonomy to individual parents to decide where the funds go within the schools, within either the school districts, the charter schools, or private schools. And that would allow them to ensure that they receive the best education regardless of how you structure the back end of it, okay? You can also, as Representative Frank has pointed out, you can also provide the school districts much more autonomy over how they use the funds as well. That would also be a good thing, as long as you still provide parents the option to choose something else if that distribution of funds by the district isn't working out for their individual family. So those recommendations would help increase the transparency, it would help increase the efficiency, it would help increase the equity and the fairness of the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I told you it was a simple system. Thank you for the explanation. Representative Frank?
Is there any wonder that while the Supreme Court said it was constitutional, they also called it Byzantine? It is a bit difficult. I also wanted to clarify one other thing, that I'm not into mental fabrication, but also you said there were 4 experts up here, and I wanted to clarify that in fact there were 3 experts and a legislator. Hey, I didn't need that. I can make fun of myself. I don't need your help. No, I really do appreciate TPPF hosting this, because we really need to, as conservatives, dive into the big government issues. And a lot of times we avoid them. We talk bad about them, but we don't get into them and understand them so that we can manage them, because in Texas we are in charge. And so we need to understand it better. Now, why they chose me, I'm not sure. I'm a homeschool dad. And I know why. I'll get to it. But I've actually done 3 panels this week. The first one was on the Bureau of Land Management grab on the Red River, and I understood why they asked me there, because 2 of those 3 counties are mine. Their Bureau of Land Management is trying to take about 45,000 acres, so I got that. And then yesterday I spoke on CPS, which was great. My wife and I have fostered, and we've adopted out of that, and we're out of the system, and I'm carrying some legislation, so I understand that. And then they asked me to do school finance, and I said, wait a second, I'm a homeschool dad. There's only one reason that you would do that, is that I wrote a newsletter to my constituents after the Supreme Court ruled on the constitutionality. And I make the mistake sometimes of thinking the only people that read my newsletters, and most of the time it is my constituents, and in fairness, not everybody reads them. I get that. But we have about a 30% open rate, so it's pretty good. So I wrote a newsletter explaining really the Constitution, or why the Supreme Court ruled it constitutional. And then I wrote a second one saying it was kind of more of, if I was a king, here's what I might do. And that got a little more traction. The Texas Tribune wrote a newspaper, or a article on it. And I got to tell you, the first time the Tribune picks up your article, you don't want this as your headline. It says, Texas legislators wonders if new school tax might bring less pain. Because when you hear what I said, that is not what I said, but you don't get to write the article. And actually, the guy who wrote it, I read it, and I was like, how did he get that? But anyway, you don't get to decide that. So hear me out. I don't want to be accused, if anybody goes and reads it, I don't want to go, what new tax were you wanting to do? That is not it. One of the advantages I have, I guess, is I'm a homeschool dad, so I'm always having to talk. My school superintendents don't necessarily trust me anyway, even though I work with them, and I think the reality is, as an employer and as a citizen, the education of citizens is important, and that's why it's in the state constitution that we take care of that we need to have an efficient education system. It's not just about your particular kids, it's about society as a whole. We want it to run, and we want it to run efficiently. One of the nice things in my district, I represent 6 counties, 17 school districts, and I have some districts that are way over the state average. I have some districts that are well under the state average, and so no matter what position I take on any school funding issue, I'm going to have some people mad and some people happy, so I kind of say, well, I'm just going to try to do what makes sense for the most people in the state of Texas, and it ends up being a little easy. That, and I was perfectly happy before I got into this role, so if I make too many people mad, that's okay too. But there's a couple things when you address school finance, and Michael touched on it, is nobody actually can answer the question how much we're spending per student. In fact, I leaned over and I said, hey, I'm not sure I agree with your number on this, because everybody, and then you went in and explained it perfectly, what those differences are. But nobody understands it. The first time I went to a TPPF meeting, I was sitting, it may have been in this room, and I was hearing them talk about $5,500 a student. $5,500 a student. How many of y'all heard that number a lot? You hear it all the time. I promise you half the no, I don't want to get quoted for that. A lot of the legislators think that that's what we're funding schools at. They really do. And Tom is just going, yeah, well, I know. And I had known, because I was kind of a geek, and I didn't have a race the first time, so I was just studying issues. I had already done the math and looked at it, and I was like, we were over $10,000, so it really surprised me to show up to a conservative meeting and hear that we were funding at $5,500, and I went up and asked the guy afterwards, and he started explaining it into the same language that Michael did, and I had the same look that you guys did, which is, what? And so I'm going to walk through what I thought would be a way to solve school finance that a lot of people won't say because it's a little risky, and a lot of people won't say because it may sound non-conservative, even though I think if you listen to the whole thing, it is not. There's 2 things when we try to address school finance that people talk about. First of all, when they say school finance is broken, that means different things to different people. But it usually means one of 2 things. When a lot of people say school finance is broken, they just say it's not adequate enough. There's not enough money in there. And I would tell you that anybody who thinks it's at $5,500 may have a point, but it's not. It is, depending on what you do, I always use $10,750, and I can walk through that math. That's the actual number of, that's the enrollment. That includes, because it does count, money spent on buildings does count. Okay, and most people when they talk about it don't count the money spent on buildings. And so I use $10,750, and so that's a number, when you tell people that, most people go, well, that seems like a lot. In Wichita Falls, we have 3 private schools. Most of them are $7,000 to $8,000 a year. And so when most people, and I know a lot of places, the private schools are a lot more than that, but that's a fair chunk of money. And especially then, because the next question I say is, well, how many kids do you want in each class? And they'll say, well, they always use a high number, 18, 20. Okay, so 20 times $10,750, that's over $200,000. You pay the teacher, how much administration do you want? And they go, well, that seems like a lot of money. And I think at the end of the day, I certainly believe we are putting adequate amount of money in schools at the $10,750. Now, that being said, we, the state, and not we, the federal government, but the federal government, make schools spend money in areas that they don't want to spend money. If you said I have $11,000 to spend per kid, and I actually get to spend it intelligently, and not hire people I don't want to hire to count numbers I don't want to count, and have personnel that I don't really want and aren't teaching kids, then it may or may not be enough money. But if you let me spend it, if you let the school district spend it and you allow the parents to hold those school districts accountable for results, you allow some flexibility in kids being able to move around, then I think it is certainly, and I think most people would agree that $10,000 to $11,000 a kid is plenty. And so what I focused on in mine was, is it equitable system? And I know in my own district, well, I'm not going to say my own district, I don't want to call it out, there's huge discrepancies in how much per student gets funded. And really a lot of times it is capricious as, are the oil wells on this side of the county line or that side of the county line, or the windmill? Is the commercial property, where is it? Where did you draw the line? Did the apartment complex end up in that school district or another school district? And who draws the school district lines? Well, the state. The state draws all the school district. Everybody's in it, the state ultimately does that. Whose constitutional responsibility is it to fund schools? States. But we've abdicated it essentially to the schools, and then we give them the appearance of control, but then we take it back in what occasionally is called by the courts a state property tax, a statewide property tax, and then we have to change it again to leave them some latitude, but not very much, because if we give them too much, then the equity is, there's a difference in equity. So the bottom line is I think that's where we ought to spend time focusing. I said, in a perfect world, this is where occasionally I make the mistake again of putting something in writing that I shouldn't. In a perfect world, the state would handle the revenue side of it and then allow the schools to spend it okay. And then we would allow the schools to spend it much more freely, because I think if most schools, if they didn't have to mess with the revenue collection, and I won't get into the whole, we make schools bob for dollars all the time. We've got people in back rooms just trying to figure this out, to figure out a way to maximize the revenue instead of teaching kids, okay? So if we would just make the funding equal regardless of where you are in the state, I believe it would make for a much more efficient solution. But it's just a thought. So the reason that he said new taxes, I actually made the mistake of throwing out the statewide commercial property tax, consolidated funding districts, or statewide property tax. Don't look at me evil. I was just talking in very big picture, because the system we have now clearly requires a lot of clearly creates a lot of inefficiencies. And it's not, I think it convolutes how much we are spending. It confuses school districts, school board members, and you have a system where the vast majority of the people making the laws that regulate the schools of this state don't truly understand the systems that they're voting on. And so I'm not sure if any of these are actually the answer, but I think the more simple we make it, the more effective I think we'll legislate and run the schools. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Representative Frank. Next up, we have Dr. Pierce.
What you just heard Representative Frank say is exactly what should be done. And it's also what we don't do. The last time that the legislature looked at the cost of providing sufficient funding to accomplish a particular goal with a group of students was in the 2004 session, or interim, the interim between 2003 and 2004. They had somebody from Texas A&M, the state actually hired this done. It was a good idea. And they went out and did a study. And do you know how much that changed the funding elements after they had the study and they knew what the costs were and how they were? Not one nickel, because it didn't match the money that was available at that time. And that's what's been driving how we fund public education, is based upon how much money is available. And so if we would get off that, if we would get off all of the intricacies of this convoluted system we have, and get down to the issue of what do we want our children to be able to do when they leave public education, regardless of whether it's an ISD or a charter school, they're both public schools. What do we want them to be able to do when they leave public schools? And then say, how do we get there? And what is the cost of getting there? That's legitimate. And we have a fundamental system, the base system, that attempts to do that, although it's much, much outdated. Some of the formulas go back 30 years. Well, what if I told you that in our system, we waste between $3 and $4 billion a biennium? Now, I'm going to define waste, and you disagree with this because you can define it however you want to. But this is the way I'm defining waste. When the state system expends money And the state system is state and local all together, taxes, state and local. When the state expends money that is not responsive to a recognized cost, when there's no cost associated with it, that money's waste. Now, it may be that that district needs that extra money because of some other cost over here the state's ignoring, but you can't say that makes it okay. You should address that cost. Would everybody agree with that? $3 to $4 billion. We've got this complex system, and it's so complex that legislatures generally don't understand it. It can be greatly simplified and should be greatly simplified. You know why it won't be? Because school districts have a vested interest in the complexities. If my school district benefits from a particular thing, that's going to be what I'm down here shouting about. Hallelujah, we got to put money here, we're dying over here, without regard to what's happening somewhere else. And we need to stop that and step back and look at the system as a whole. Now, I'm going to take one issue and I'm going to show you how this works. Have you heard about recapture? Oh, I hear about recapture. And I'm going to tell you something. You're going to disagree with this now, but if I had a chance to talk to you a little bit, you'd agree with me. Recapture is not only necessary, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Because the resources we draw on throughout the state to fund a state system aren't equal. And if you rely just on what you have locally, then other districts won't have what they need, and the state will have to kick in a lot more, and that raises taxes on everybody. All right, let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk about recapture. First of all, did you know that every district in the state, from the richest to the poorest, from the smallest to the largest, is recaptured? We don't hear about it because they don't write a check. I'm going to show you how it works. So go to this slide here. Every state's recaptured. Do you see that little rectangle that's out to the side? That's what we call a mistake, because that's not supposed to be there. I did that to measure it for another slide, and I forgot to erase it. So if you mentally would erase that little rectangle, I would appreciate it. Right. We have district funding amounts, and there's a state portion and there's a local portion. It's between the state and local, because we have local property tax and we have state funding. All right, go to the next one if you would. Whenever, can you toggle back to? I want you to go back one, and what's that red part? All right, go back. You see how the red part went up? As the wealth of the state improves, as districts are more able to raise locally the money they need to fill their bucket of the amount of money they need, what happened to the blue? It went down. The state retained that money. They didn't need to put it out. So for that district, they were recaptured that amount of money, that their value went up, that they were putting into it, and the state no longer did. One more, hit it one more time. Go forward. Now that's classy. You got animation here. I don't see anybody else here, unless the doctor down there does it, that had animation, so I won't credit. When you write your evaluation, don't you say the animation was cool, and that's also all right. So when the money goes up into that state general fund, it may not even get back to public education. It just goes. But that's recapture, and it's every bit as much recapture for a poor district as it is a wealthy district. All right, let's go forward. This is the truth in our system. If you were to take the districts that are currently being recaptured in Tier 1, those are the heavy recapture districts, and you were to look, there's 151 of them, their M&O tax rate average is $1.32, 1.032, a little over $1.03. Their funding level per weighted student is a little over $7,000. And you can ignore that. I put it up there so you can tell I'm doing the math right. But you can ignore that one. Look at the tax rate. Look over here on the right. The average district that is in that group has a classroom advantage over the rest of the state, not just the poor districts, the rest of the state, $38,000 per classroom of 22 kids. Now, they're the ones right now that's getting all the press about recapture. And they've got a pretty darn good deal. You're never going to hear anybody say that, But that's the truth. They're already funded well above other people. Why are we trying to get rid of recapture so they can have even more? But let's just say, no, I disagree with recapture on whatever grounds, and I want to get rid of it. And these people, the rest of the state, with 6 cents higher tax rate, you just have to lump it. It's your fault there's not oil in the ground where you live. So let's go to the next one. You did away with recapture, and that's what it becomes. And this is if the state raised about $1.5 billion to $2 billion a year to make up for the lost revenue from recapture. So your taxes went up all over the state because they got to raise this extra money. And look what the classroom advantage did. These people, the rest of the state, they stayed where they are at the lower level. They stayed where they are. $288,000 per classroom. That's nearly unbelievable, isn't it? I rechecked it 3 times because I thought it can't be that high, and it is. That's the reason why we have to have recapture as a function. Because the wealth of the state is so grouped in areas that that sort of thing happens in those 151 districts. Now let's go to the next slide. There are other ways you can do this. You could eliminate recapture, and then you could just cut everybody else in the state who's funded at the lower levels. You remember that $38,000 that the other group had? You could take the ones that didn't have that $38,000, and you could lower the basic allotment, the cornerstone of our school funding, from $51.40 currently to $49.04. That costs the people who have the least about $6,000 per classroom. In the wealthiest districts, they would be skied up with that extra $6,000. Let's go to the next one. Here's another thing that you can do. You can leave that $39,000, I think that's $38,000. That's a mistake too. I guess I lost credit for the animation right there, didn't I? That's 38, whatever's on that first slide, $38,000. All right, you could leave them with that advantage and just let everybody change their tax rates where the state doesn't put any more money in and everybody just tax locally. Their tax rate with that $38,000 advantage would be 74 cents. Look what happens to the rest of the state. They go up to nearly the state average, nearly the state cap on average. Some districts went up as high as $2.50 to $3, which of course is not going to happen. It doesn't work. We've got a system that works with recapture, and we need to quit thinking about getting rid of that and start thinking about what Representative Frank said. We need to start thinking about what does it cost to educate children, taking into consideration that different kids cost different amounts. Take that into consideration and fund that. And quit letting school districts come down and try to game the system to get our little group out here funded at a higher level without regard to cost. That's what equity is. It's okay to give some people more than others if they got higher cost. If you travel from San Antonio here, your travel's going to be more than somebody who walked across the street. It's okay if you draw more because of that. But it ought to be related to a cost. And we never focus on that. We never focus on what Representative Frank said. I'm going to give you an example. If you'll go to the next one. Houston ISD is a huge school district. It's nearly like a country of its own. And right now, you've been hearing about their recapture. And it's a big dollar amount. They said $162 million. That's a big dollar amount. But they got a bunch of kids down there. So relative to kids, it's not really as much as lots of other people are. Did you know that they're getting state funding? Every district in the state pays recapture. Every district in the state gets state funding. You never hear about that. Look at the amount of state funding. This comes from the TEA Summary of Finance, online summary. 2016-17, these are not the numbers that Houston's using. They're using their own estimates. These are TEA estimates. So what is the recapture? 175 is what they have. I'll use TEA's because I don't have Houston's numbers. They're talking about that big number. You're killing us. We're going to never make it because we're having to lose that much. They don't tell you that their state funding went up. They don't tell you that this excess came out of excess collections and they really didn't lose any money. They're still funded at a high level. That's $177 per watt. Now I want to go one more. The people in Houston that pay the taxes, how much time do I have? 1 minute, thank you. I know it hasn't seemed like 11 minutes, but it has. All right. The people in Houston are the ones that pay the taxes are being recaptured. The school district doesn't own those taxes. It's a government entity. Government entities do not have, this is my money. It belongs to the people who live in that community. So some of those people send their kids to charter schools. David Dunn is the head of the charter school people, does an excellent job. Charter schools are serving a great purpose in giving people choice in the state. $270 million, as near as we can calculate, of state funding, 100% goes to those charter schools because they can't tax. They can't tax. They get all their money from the state. So if you were to take that 50-something million that Houston is actually being recaptured, the state's putting more money with it and sending it all back to Houston ISD children and Houston ISD taxpayers. Houston ISD needs to quit talking about their little problem and start thinking about the state as a whole, and let's do what's right for kids, let's do what's right for taxpayers.
Thank you, Dr. Pierce. Last but not least, we have Dr. Scafidi.
Is my PowerPoint going to be popped up or? Guess not. I'm here to talk about the snow. It's not bragging, but I am the second best economist up here, so. I'm a professor at Kennesaw State University in Georgia, and I'm also a fellow with EdChoice, formerly the Milton and Rose Friedman Foundation of Educational Choice. I'm here to talk about transparency, fairness, and productivity in the Texas education system. Who thinks that Texas public schools, adjusted for inflation by the CPI, I know that overstates inflation, but that's what I used. Who thinks Texas public schools spend more now than 1992 or less now? Who thinks they spend more? Who thinks they spend less per student? Oops. It's actually more. Texas public school students, so this is per student, adjusted for inflation, spends almost 20% more in 2014 relative to students in Texas public schools in 1992. All right, that's transparency number one. All right, second, do you think teacher salaries went up by 20%? No. Actually, they've only went on 1%. You can squint. There's something there. I put it in University of Texas colors because they beat us in football. Sex salaries went up by 1%. Right? Where did the money go? One place it went to was staff, and I call this the staffing surge. So to your left, that's the increase in full-time equivalent students from 1992 to 2014 in Texas public schools. So there's been about a 50% increase in students. Staff has increased by almost twice as much, 95%. Who were those staff? I put all Texas public school staff into two buckets, teachers and everybody else. Teachers increased only 53%. So you only had a very tiny decrease in average class sizes over that time. All right? But everyone else went up 174%. That's where the money went. Let's do the following thought experiment. Right? Economists, we like to talk about opportunity costs, right? We also like to talk about calculators, but that's another issue, right? What if that 174% had only gone up at the 49% increase in students, right? What if the increase in administrators and other staff had merely matched the increase in students? What would have been the savings to the Texas public school system, and what could you have done with that money? I'm making an assumption that the total employment cost of these folks on the right is $55,000 per. So that's salary, insurance, retirement, FICA, unemployment insurance, all the total cost. Now for a parapro, a teacher's aide, a janitor, $55,000 is a bit high. But for an assistant principal, a curriculum director, an area superintendent, $55,000 is shockingly low. I've looked at Georgia data, and $55,000 is much lower than the truth for them. All right? If that 174% had only gone up at 49%, that would have saved you $7.4 billion with a B in annual recurring savings year after year after year. What could you do with $7.4 billion instead of hiring a bunch of extra people? You could have given every teacher a $22,000 raise. That'd be one thing. Another thing is you could have cut property taxes. Another thing, you could give 900-some thousand students $8,000 scholarships to go to the school of their choice, right? Now, I give this talk to state legislatures all over the country. The question I always get from a rural Republican is, isn't that the feds? Isn't that the state? So what I do now is I do the data for every school district in the state, because the rural guys think it's always in the big city. It's everywhere. And you know what? The patterns don't match up. If it was all the state, you would see the same pattern in districts within a state. If it was all the feds, you'd see the same pattern across states. You don't. It's all over the map. I mean, 48 states have this kind of staffing surge, but it's all over the place. It's random. It's different. So yes, surely the feds are to blame, as Dr. Pierce said. Surely the state's to blame, but it's also the locals to blame. There's blame all around, all right? This is a national problem, like I'm saying. This is 1950 to 2009, a paper I wrote for EdChoice called The Staffing Surge. The number of students in America, this is the United States, number of students doubled. Total school personnel went up 4 times as fast as the increase in students since 1950. Teachers, 2.5 times the increase in students. Administrators and other staff, 7 times the increase in students. All right. There's no evidence the kids are worse today, harder to teach. There's 3 studies to the contrary, right? No Child Left Behind did not cause this. No Child Left Behind moderated this, right? American public schools are more top-heavy than other wealthy nations. Oops. All right. What about student achievement? Well, surely student achievement skyrocketed as we added all these bodies, right? Yes, it did. All right. Actually, so if you look at 92 to 09, right, there was a staffing surge in the United States. Public school graduation rates did go up 1 point. So, aha! But you've always got to put data in context. Let's look at the period right before that. 1970 and 1992, graduation rates fell 5 points during that staffing surge. So I don't see a relationship between graduation rates and staffing. During the Great Recession, 09 to 13, again, this is national data, look where they cut. They cut teachers. I'm writing a paper on this now. I wanted to call it Heads Administrators Win, Tails Teachers and Students Lose, but my colleagues at EdChoice thought that was too kitschy, right? But so graduation rates skyrocketed when we cut staff, right? All right. Now let's talk about the next 2 things, fairness and productivity, right? And I want to disagree with Dr. Pierce on one thing. I agree with your diagnosis of the problem, but I think I have a different solution. There's only so many dollars that taxpayers have, right? That's all there is. They got to eat, they got to pay rent, right? They got to, pay for health care, they got to do this, they got to do that, and they got to pay their taxes. So there's only so much money. I think we, as elected officials, you need to make sure that that money is doled out fairly and that we get the most bang for the buck. We get the most education productivity for the buck. And my solution to that would be to give all parents education savings accounts. I know there was a panel on this yesterday where 2 of my friends presented. All right. Nevada actually passed this into law in 2015, but then it was litigated. The courts said the program was constitutional, but they said there was a technical problem with the bill, that the legislature didn't appropriate money for it. So it's like a 2-line fix, but so the program's in limbo right now because it just got declared unconstitutional. But the Nevada program would give all students in Nevada public schools that had been there 100 days in the prior year at least, an education savings account. If they're poor or if they're special needs, it would be $5,700 a kid. If they're not poor or not special needs, it would be $5,100 a kid on average. That's transparency. You can change your public school funding system any way you want. It will never be transparent. It's an inherent problem. My kids, 4 of them, are in a public school, right? 3 of them are in the gifted. They get smaller class sizes and better teachers. You don't observe how much money is spent on that kid versus that kid, right? The only way we can have fairness and transparency is if you, as some of the speakers said, is if you give the money on like a card and put a dollar amount on it and give it to a parent and say, go find a school. If you go to a public school, they get that money. If you go to a private school, they get that money. If you go to a charter school, they get that money. I don't know if you guys we have a K-12 virtual school in Georgia. My kids went there one year. It was fantastic. You give them there, it goes to that school, right? In Nevada, they can spend their coupon with a dollar amount on it. It's really a debit card on private school tuition, tutoring, services like therapies outside of school for special needs students, textbooks, dual enrollment fees at colleges, standardized tests, and other proposals. Any money you don't spend, you can save it for college, right, to give people an incentive to be cost conscious. Right? There's only one regulation in the Nevada program. I don't like it, but probably all of you are for it. All students that get an ESA must take a nationally recognized norm reference test. The state will get the results from that test and aggregate the results, and then they'll eventually do that with graduation rates. The reason I don't like that is we spend way too much time and focus on testing. I think we need to let parents decide what tests they want. John and I think, wrote a piece called Let Parents Decide School Choice Tests, right? I polled private schools in Georgia. 99.5% of them give a standardized test to their students every year. The schools that didn't were the ones for severely special needs students where it's not appropriate. Right? 3 final thoughts. If you're not going to pursue a program of universal school choice, what makes you think this time's going to be different? This staffing surge has been going on since 1950. One of the architects of the Great Society, he's still alive, was a social scientist at Harvard named Christopher Jenks. He wrote a piece in 1966, before I was born, that said it's time to have school vouchers. He goes, we've been for decades debating how to reform public schools. He said it was too late in 1966, right? That was a long time ago, right? Second, if you do pursue universal school choice, I agree with the previous speakers, you've got to give the public schools flexibility to compete. This is not an anti-public school thing. This is not a pro-private school thing. This is a pro-good school thing. Let parents choose the best schools, give schools flexibility to compete. And finally, I'm not for this, but I've worked a lot in state capitals, so I kind of get politics now more than I wish I knew. Maybe, I'm not against school choice in rural areas, I'm all for it. But maybe exempt them if you have to politically, right? Here's some studies that might be of interest at EdChoice. You can kind of gather what they are from the title. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Scafidi. So now as we went through this simple school finance system, I'm sure there's not any questions. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to Q&A. We have a microphone back here, so please wait until she brings you the mic and keep your questions in the form of a question, as we have many people who have probably raised their hand. Back in the back.
My question comes out of something that, bless his heart, I've actually heard the mayor of Austin say about school funding, where he likes to talk about the reason property taxes locally in Travis County are so high is because the legislature, quote unquote, doesn't fund education adequately. And the one shred of truth in that is that the reason property taxes locally are so high is because Austin ISD spends too much money regardless of recapture. So my question is, in any potential school finance solution or fix that we see, what about provisions to hold local tax districts to seek voter approval if they want to go above the effective tax rate?
Anybody like to hit on that one?
I guess I will since I will try.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a push and a shove between us mandating things on local school districts. In what I had talked about, sorry, you told me to go close. To me, one of the advantages of having every kid get the same throughout the state is it makes it much more clean. And then you're just measuring how effective those school districts are at spending right now. And I don't know enough about Austin ISD to know whether they're a high, do you know what their average or how much revenue they have per kid? I'm guessing it's high.
I wouldn't, not off the top of my head, but they're routinely their total budget
I mean, I think to me, one of the nice things, and it is kind of a simplistic, I mean, one of the challenges, anytime we deal with an issue like this, there's all this data that's hard to get, right? If everybody is getting around $11,000 per kid, then the question is, how effective is Austin ISD at spending that? If they want, if you have a district like that I don't know what they're at, but if they're at 13 or 14,000, then they have the ability to waste money, whereas somebody else in a different part of the country or a different part of the state is scrimping. So I don't think I answered your question because I don't really know what the controls are on the school districts.
One, I don't know if I can answer your question, but just to provide a little bit of context with the court challenges in the past, when you allow the individual communities to vote on their tax rate, you're going to have different tax rates across the state. Some communities are perfectly fine pouring large and ever-increasing amounts into their schools. Some communities are okay with that historically. Others won't vote for taxes even if they're necessary for public education, okay? So from the state perspective, that creates a problem because the Constitution and the courts require funding to be equitable. Okay, so you should have local autonomy, as Representative Frank has mentioned, in the way that the money is spent, but it would be good to have a central system for raising the revenue for public education, which is what Texas used to do, by the way. Until in the 60s, we got rid of the statewide property tax. Before that, the courts have observed we had a uniform system for collecting revenue. There wasn't a higher tax rate in one school district than the other. And that's, I think, a good solution as well.
There has been some discussion in the Senate on having automatic rollback type provisions when you look at property taxes, so that might be a potential issue there as well. Yeah, right. Yeah. There are other issues looking at. Right. Yeah.
I think this is one of the challenges anytime you have multiple levels of government responsible for funding the same thing. I mean, that's part of the reason that schools have trouble spending their money because they have three different people giving them guidelines on what they're supposed to do. You know, if you say one level of government is responsible for it, then it makes it much more clean and much more, I believe, efficient. I find it funny because I've listened to some of the, you hear the Austin stuff a lot living here. I live in Wichita Falls, but being here a lot. And people say, well, the local taxpayer is paying too much. The state and the federal needs to pay more, as if those are actually different people. I mean, I don't know. None of my constituents care whether I take it out of their left pocket or their right pocket or their back pocket, and that's what we do as a government. We take it from all three places to fund.
Yep.
And that's very inefficient.
Question right up here.
Yeah. Now, aren't cities...
Please announce who you are.
Cities like San Antonio voted in a separate tax to get around the recharge rate to fund early childhood education. Don't they fall into that same equitable situation about where the money comes from?
Yeah, San Antonio, you're talking about having vote on tax rates. When you get above $1.04, you have to get voter approval, called tax ratification election. And so San Antonio went from $1.04 to $1.17, which is the maximum. And lots of people do that because it's kind of hard to get there, so you want to do it while you can and not have elections every year. But San Antonio is a property poor district, and they will be subject to a calculated recapture on those last pennies only because we haven't raised the recapture level on those last pennies. They're very low funded. So they'll have a calculator, but they're not really a recapture district. They're net. They're a winner with state funds.
Other questions? Yes, back in the back.
Thank you. My name is Kristen Tassan. I'm actually board president in Fort Bend ISD. And I had two questions. One for Mr. Scafidi, is that right? I wanted to know if your numbers take into account the rise in regulation over the past several years that school districts have to deal with. And my other question, or I guess it's sort of a question and a statement, what we have proposed, we don't have a problem with recapture in the sense that we want equity across the state. But our concern is when money is taking, the caps are put on and the money is taken back by the state and it goes into the general fund and it's not required to be spent on education. So what we have advocated for is transparency in the one point that Mr. Barber pointed out is that if our constituents vote for a certain tax rate, they expect Fort Bend ISD to get the funds that we collect, and the constituents don't understand the system, obviously, and that money goes back to the state. And so there's confusion in how it's set up now with our constituents voting for a particular tax rate, but our district doesn't see the benefit of that, number one. But number two, that when the money is recaptured, that it doesn't always go back into education. And so those are the two things that you know, it's very difficult to explain to our community and our constituency. And that's what we're advocating for is just transparency in the system and to be sure that those funds go back into education. And that's something that we hope gets addressed.
Dr. Scafidi, would you like to answer the first one?
Sure. Yeah, I was just documenting the rise in staffing in public schools. I did not get at the cause, but I'm telling you, I've looked at it across states and across districts in about 30 states, and the pattern doesn't suggest a single cause. It's not all federal, it's not all state. Some of it is local decision, and it varies by district. My position is, why do we think in the future it's going to be different? You know, because it's still the same system. I think we need to blow up the system.
Could I make a comment?
Sure.
By the way, your superintendent is president of the Equity Center Board. Don't tell him about those two mistakes I made. Okay. One of the things that we're trying to do, and it's in our legislative charges for this time, is that whenever you, as a board member, whenever y'all vote to set a tax rate, regardless of where it is, you're telling the people this is a tax for public education. Now, we've gone far enough with recapture that people know that there's a chance that some of that might end up back in the state at the state level. What they don't know and what they expect you to do is they don't know that it's not all going to public education. But they think it is. They expect it to be because it is a tax for public education. So regardless of whether it's recaptured or not, whatever pressure is taken off the state because you're able to raise more locally, that money needs to go into public education for new students, because that's about $2.5 billion a biennium, or maybe to raise the basic allotment or something, so it comes back to districts. And the issue about how you spend it and how much you should have, that's really a separate issue from that.
Another question right back here.
Okay, full disclosure, I'm a homeschool mom. So my kids aren't in the system. But can we talk about facilities for a moment? In this state, I have seen, I've lived in 2 other states. I went to school in portables, okay? I haven't seen a portable in Texas. I've seen, well, not where I live, I'll tell you that. All I've seen are Taj Mahal high schools that are putting us in serious debt, perpetual debt, because the schools come after us for more bond debt, more bond debt, more bond debt, more bond debt, virtually every election cycle. And they have a lock on how they get it passed because they have the polling sites at the schools. And they don't tell everybody else that doesn't have their kids in the schools about the election. It's kind of rigged, in my opinion, the way it's being done now. And I really feel like, why can't we just have, if you're going to have an elementary school, here's the set of plans, here's the architecture, here's how you're going to build this, how much money you're going to get, and all of them are going to be uniform. And here's what a middle school is going to get, and here's what a high school is going to look like. Why do we have these custom site built into these gorgeous mountain tops with stadiums that are lit? Their baseball stadiums are lit. My football stadium wasn't lit where I went to school. So, I mean, it's so over the top crazy. This is being forcibly taken from people who may not even have the money to give it so that they can have bells and whistles that don't even apply to education.
Thank you. Dr. Scafidi, then we'll come down here.
Amen. And under a universal education savings account system, you'd write a dollar amount on a card, give it to the family, so no money's earmarked for facilities, no money's earmarked for this, no money's earmarked for counselors or that or the other thing, and then the parents can decide which schools to go to, and if they want good facilities, they can choose that. If they want less on facilities and more money spent on teachers, they can choose that.
Mr. Barba?
So I would reiterate that and kind of state it in a little bit of a different way. I think it's okay for a local community, a local school board, to decide how to allocate the dollars that they receive from the state, and they should have more flexibility in how they do that, right? If an individual parent is not happy with the way the dollars are allocated, they should be able to take those somewhere else. I think that's the ultimate solution to increase efficiency in the system.
Yeah, if I could just chime in, sorry. Yeah, I don't think you want it centralized in Austin, what types of buildings are going to be built around the state. I really don't. I hear your point, but I think these other solutions are a lot better way to get at what you're talking about.
All right. I think we have time for just one quick question, if you don't mind, right up here.
I'm going to probably embarrass myself asking this question, but I'll do it. It's probably somebody else doesn't know either. With recapture, what is the advantage of a school district raising their tax rate?
The way that recapture works is it's a percentage of your total collection. So the recapture comes out of all of the pennies. So whenever, it's not like the last pennies are what you use to pay your recapture and you get to keep the first pennies. A certain part of that, every penny comes out for recapture. So when you raise your tax rate, then you will get the part that you retained. And so every additional penny does bring in more money to the district.
But if you go to this where every school gets the same price, regardless of whether it's charter school, public school, I guess they're all public school.
Would you mind waiting for the mic real quick?
But if you go to where there's standardized funding, for whatever you call it, where every student gets that card, then in that situation, why would there be an advantage to a school district raising their taxes?
You wouldn't, in my opinion. You would have a standard rate, either across the state if it was state, or if it was done by MSAs. You would have a standard rate.
All right.
Thank you.
Good point.
Thank you all so much. Please thank our panelists. Remember, this is CLE accredited, so please sign in the back. And I think it's important that we make it equitable by student. So anyway, thank you all. Have a great day.